Hello and welcome. I'm Deirdre Byrne of Five Leaves Bookshop. I'm really pleased to welcome David Morley this evening. David trained as an ecologist in the Lake District. He won the Ted Hughes Award for The Invisible Gift, his selected poems. He's won many awards. The Gypsy and the Poet was a Poetry Book Society recommendation. The Invisible Kings, also a PBS Society recommendation, was chosen as TLS Book of the Year. David pioneered podcasting and creative writing through his slow poetry and writing challenges, spoken word projects. He's Professor of Creative Writing at Warwick and at Monash Universities, and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. David will be reading tonight from his latest book, Fury, also a PBS choice. It was shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best Collection. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat box. So I'll see you later. Welcome, David.
Well, hello, everybody. It's great to see you. The text for the poems is going to appear, I hope, on the screen as I read them, although I won't be reading the screen. Thank you to Five Leaves Bookshop for inviting me this evening, but also to Kathy Bell, also who's out there right now. Thank you very much for suggesting it. And to Deirdre, and also to Simon and to Pippa Hennessy, who's making this evening possible. Fury is a book that emerged out of the past 4 years. And in some ways, the culmination of those 4 years is taking place right now in the negotiations with the EU. Fury is certainly a political fury that I felt with what has happened since 2016 and what is to come. But fury is also emerges from other furies within inside myself, some of which are less overt. These would include my own cultural background from Romani's, but also the fury that I possess, which is not to be heard, but which I hear all the time, which is of having a stammer, of finding it quite difficult to express myself in words, in sound. The first poem I'm going to read you is from a sequence of poems in the book. It was originally written as a 98-line pantoum, but the lines do not repeat exactly, they just repeated in tone. But they're kind of written from the point of view of the writer or the person as a kind of a lyrebird. Now, I spent some time in Australia, and I have encountered lyrebirds. Lyrebirds are amazing mimics. They're really melodious and complex in terms of birdsong. And one of the ways that they court and present themselves is through the imitation of other birds and animals, but also because they're superlative mimics, they also imitate human sounds, including human voices, but also things like camera shutters and spot welding machines and loggers cutting down trees. So the poem is a kind of mimic of the world. It was something I was exploring in this poem, and the voices from the poem kind of pass to and fro between two people. So I'm just going to read the first of the lyrebirds. Your vow is the lyrebird's thesaurus of mimicry. Your vow yaffles with the laughter of a kookaburra. Your vow sings the syllables you share with our children. Your vow lullabies a jungle's stories, canopies, and understory. My vow catapults a kingfisher past a kookaburra. My vow scales a frozen waterfall's icicled aviary. My vow strips a eucalypt's paper bark for nests for rainbow lorries. My vow ploughs a ridge walk through a peat bog's slog and slurry. Your vow paints Jane Austen's miniatures on 2 inches of ivory. Your vow quickens a bare forest with your footsteps in snow. Your vow spills its watershed through the fells, tarns and freshets, and startles snowdrops from the floor of heaven. My vow hushes a fair forest and my footsteps in snow. My vow spies a single star from out the wide night's numbers. There are many voices in this book, some of which can be my own, but which are really speaking through characters. Many of the characters are travellers. Some of them are storytellers, and therefore the poems are written as dramatic monologues. The poem I'm about to read next is an excerpt from a longer poem in which a Romani traveller, who's a kind of shaman or magician to his tribe, begins to tell his story directly to an interlocutor, which is basically me. And then the story proceeds to kind of lay out how his kind of self-destruction has happened and where it might end up. But it starts with him speaking very directly. And the poem is called The Throne Voice. The story starts with who you are. I strode at night across the heath to hear a nightjar. It was night which throws her voice inside a bird. I would stand below his song and become cast into creature, into his purled world. The bird could never be seen. It seemed a soft scar of sound, as if a lone tree's bark sang the night's wound from a lone tree's bough. And yet heath and bird were grown two in the dark. Those wound, wounded voices were thrown into me, as if bird and tree were hornbooks I could finger and trace and sing aloud. I spoke through night, or night through me, and all the creatures of the night sang free. My gypsies gave tongue to campfire stories, but my spell drew speech from the circling heath. I was a magician to them, the magic man to my people. I lost it. I lost my magic when I lost those voices. I cried my eyes out. I cried my eyes into myself. How can you know what it is like to lose your magic? Romani as a language is something that I've been obsessed by for a long time now. I've introduced it into many of my books, and I hope it's had some influence upon the kind of growing number of young writers who have come forward and who are using Romani in their own work. But I'm aware that to a lot of people, Romani is a kind of lost language. And it's certainly called by some people Pagadi Jib, which means a broken language. But my view, which we can talk about in the questions if you like, is that language can die for all sorts of reasons. But one of the reasons it might die or be broken is through a lack of imagination. But it can also be lost through silence. And silence in Romani is Myrnamos. Now in this poem, I use a particular form to evoke Myrnamos, silence. And it kind of concerns something that's happened within Roma, which is that things which are unclean or are considered to be marime untouchable and unspeakable. For example, the Romani Holocaust, which is called the parajamos, which means the devouring, was never talked about because, or written about because it was unclean, it was marame, and therefore it was set aside. And this silence upon the subject, this shared marame, is what leads to Myrnamos. After the burial of the Gypsy matriarch, the Roma are torching her proud Vardo in Myrnamos. The Yog leaps into the burrow and billows in Myrnamos. Pater, Satlia, Patura, her possessions flare in Myrnamos. Heraclo shuffles her banker, palms them out in Myrnamos. The Yag leaps into the burrow and billows in Myrnamos. Her lurcher is Na Cheval from the Campo in Myrnamos. Heraclo shuffles her banker, palms them out in Myrnamos. The Jucal peers and peers from the whoosh in Myrnamos. Her lurcher is Na Cheval from the Campo in Myrnamos. Para, tower to the Kritza, collapse in Myrnamos. What the Roma do not say to each other is buried in Myrnamos. Their Vardos circle the field. They vanish in Myrnamos. Pater, Satlia, Patura. Everything burns in Myrnamos. What the Roma do not say to each other is buried in Myrnamos. The Roma are torching her Vardo. Everything must burn. The next poem is called Romani Wounds Me, and the dedicatee of this poem is Damien Labat, a very talented young writer I met on an Arvin course. He's half Romani, like myself. He published a book last year called The Stopping Places, about gypsies in contemporary Britain. Stow in the Wold and Kenilworth and Dereham and Horsemond and Appleby are all mentioned in this poem, and these are all traditional traveller horse fairs. And the poem is written in the voice of a traveller. It's very much informed by Brexit, this poem, and also by anti-Romani and anti-Romanian feeling in this country. Romani wounds me. Wherever I travel, Romani wounds me. As I hoved into the horse fair at Stow on the Wold, between Cotswold chintz shops and the roving road, HGVs hunkered after our wagons on the Fossway, cursing us with air brakes and grunting gear shifts. At Kenilworth Fair, with its tailbacks to Longbridge roundabout, Vardos bottlenecked behind ponies from Pershore, rocks rammed on all the verges of the villages between by neighbourhood watchers with the policeman's nod. At Dereham Fair, I crowbarred the stern stones from the wayside and flattened fat molehills under my 4x4 and snored under the stars of headlights flying across the bypass and slung the crook of my kettle above an illegal blaze. At Gressenhall, Swaffham and Peterborough, the pubs were barred to me. What did the Gentiles want? These polite people who curse us were Romanian or worse than. A copper pulls us over and barks for passports. Mate, I come from Rotherham, laughs one gypsy, though it's foreign country round these parts. And as we sleep, Europe drifts away across the sea. The cling net of England closes. Our caravans are ships with their engines flooded. Our lives are drowning. Strange people, the English. They say this land is ours, but they don't rove beyond their commutes or school runs. Imagine the coppers rocking up at their caravan sites. Meanwhile, England keeps on travelling, always travelling backwards. In my dream, our flotilla of caravans set sail from Dover's chalk shore, as though the little boats of Dunkirk were our own gypsy Vardos, as though we were machine gunned by our own Spitfires, and those brothers on the beach were our own straight kin, which we were when we were borderless and one. Between the horse fairs of Horsemondon and Appleby, at all the stopping places when I wake, and in every face I see, wherever I travel, Romani wounds me. This next poem is a huge escapade and play upon Anglo-Romani. Anglo-Romani is kind of the English version of Romani, contemporary English version of Romani. Romani is very interesting. It's rather like English, actually, in many ways. Is that it takes words from other languages, adopts them, melds them, plays with them, makes them their own, sometimes throws them away. So if you're writing in Romani, any of you with that ambition, you have to be very specific, because Romani changes according to place or region, and indeed time as well. So you have to find, what one you're writing in, and to be very kind of precise about it. But the other thing that I love about Romani too is that words can mean more than one thing at the same time. Sometimes three things, and they mean those things simultaneously. So you have to be quite precise to land those blows quite carefully. But this is just an account of a traveller called John, who's lighted up in Swansea and parked up, and is trying to spend a peaceful night before he moves on. And this is an account of his evening. It's a glossary on the side here too, if you like. Although my view is that you don't need glossaries for these poems, because the sound of Romani is also its meaning. Starling roost in Swansea, and a server of starlings, all of them sleepyhead. Chiriclos, Barricano, Buff Glossy, and Jutso, and Rookwicker to Wava in their tenement wesh of Swansea Temnamos. Matia. Rom John slows his Vardo in the slush. Into the hushaby NCP kills the lampash. Drum Catanade. Rum John pockets his Jindo. Janamos of this atching tan for the rat, with no brother Vardo or mucker in sight. No Jukuyak for the Gadji or Jikadan Daria. Aromas lux lavenge in his Jeppo. Rum John rifles a Ramakroro of Moolah, zip, as he pads Raktiako about his blunt biznizo. Wisho pay siphoned, hush. from the garage's cranto, six scored from the racklobe and the night grill, and a stylish Gemesco slash under the starry wish. Piss heads paddling home, igam ogam, fisticuffing fanaries, street steep to their feet, eavesdropping Vizhamenos of a batteria heating the Rom's Calisferia. One Kalalo Gajo thumps a philastra, fist pumps the bardo, forcing a come on from our sleep dead, snoring Rom. Ach, John, man, hear him. Zoramos, Zoramos, Zoramos. Under a riot of starlings, a react of Swansea starlings. Now, this is not going to be in that glossary, but Igam Ogam is just a word I love. It's the title of a children's program in Wales, and it's a stop-go motion piece. Because the characters move around in a slightly stiff way, stop-go, that movement is called in in Welsh Igam Ogam. And so the description of these lads who are going around bullying the traveller is because they're they're out of their heads, so they're Igam Ogam, and that's where it comes from. The next poem is called When I Heard the Calling of Birds. There's a great organization called Reprieve, which is dedicated to arguing the cases of prisoners on death row in America, but also, as importantly, arguing the cases of detainees in Guantanamo Bay. Now, the person who leads their work got in touch with me, and chiefly because of a detainee at Guantanamo called Tawfiq Bahani. And Tawfiq Bahani has been held in Guantanamo detention center since early 2003, despite never having been charged with a crime. And in 2010, Tawfiq was officially cleared for release by the Obama administration, yet he still remains detained. Tawfiq writes poetry in English and Arabic, and one of Tawfiq's poems, written to his wife, closes with the line, "When I heard the calling of birds, I remembered your sweet voice when you sang the song, Remember Me This Way." And I took his line as my starting point for a poem in the form of a gazelle. And all the birds invoked in the poem live in Guantanamo Naval Base, which paradoxically is a haven for wildlife. When I heard the calling of birds, I remembered your sweet voice when you sang, Remember Me This Way. When you folded my heart in your wing to remember me this way. When emerald hummingbirds flashed through the chain link fence, I remembered them that day. When a palm swift slipped from her nest in the dark of Camp Echo, I remembered and counted that day. When last July buntings burst in a blue cloud above my open sky cage, I remembered and blessed their day. When saffron finches dust bathed in the detention yard, I dreamt of home that day. When I heard rapid fire of woodpeckers in the pines below Camp Echo, I remembered and trembled that day. When I saw scarlet tanagers swoop across the Gulf of Guantanamo, I fled with them that day. When the oriole bowed his orange cowl from the watchtower, I remembered and feared that day. When Stygian owls plied their sorrow flutes in reeds beyond the kill zone, I remembered and wept that day. When a mourning dove swayed on her roost of razor wire above Camp Echo, I buried my heart that day. I waked to macaws squawking Tawfiq, the echo of guards bawling Bahani. My heart is folded in your wing. Remember me this way. Cherry pickers alludes here to fruit pickers. Many people who are working immigrants or travelers are employed by our agricultural businesses to pick their fruits and crop their vegetables. Cherry pickers are also elevating work platforms. Now, at 7 a.m. on the 19th of October 2011, some of you might remember the site clearance of the Dale Farm Traveller Camp. It was reported in an astonishing way, but the facts of the matter are that with this traveller camp, at 7 a.m. the electricity was disconnected. More than 100 riot police entered the site through the rear fence, and 2 people were tasered. Police then removed all the travellers from a 12-metre high scaffold tower on the front gate using cherry pickers. They plucked them off. And there was a series of poems in this book, and this is just the first one. A kestrel spears sidelong on a thermal above the camp, clasping and unclenching the load bearings of his claws. Eyes harrow the grass with ultraviolet vision, runnels or trapdoors for voles and field mice, iridescent in the hovering kestrel's retina. Down the bird plummets. Sunlight strews her wands. The JCB tears down the caravan's door, slams down its prongs, shakes its claw. What's the load bearing for a pikey's caravan? These fruit pickers' vardos, they're built like bastard houses. Prying for weakness, the bailiff stabs a corner, twists prongs, tilts on caterpillar treads, grips and rips the roof from a traveller family, breakfasting together as sunlight strews wands through the fields and hedgerows beyond their caravan's still opened windows. Out spill internal organs of a botched operation. The proudly folded teak dining table, a chandelier's glittering sprawl and glory, a cupboard loud with royal Dalton, the pot belly stove still toasty from the morning. The cherry pickers lift their arms into the sun. Before we go to questions, I'm just going to read one final poem. For those of you who are teachers, I think you're heroes, and I think you're doing the most important job in the world. It was a teacher who, at the age of 15, plucked me out of my little world of science and natural history and took me to Stratford-on-Avon to watch plays by Shakespeare. I had no knowledge of Shakespeare at that age. And one of the things that really fascinated me was to be taken around Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-on-Avon and see this little glass panel, and behind it was this wattle and daub that made up the walls of the house. And I've always been very interested, as you might guess, in birds. I'm trained as a zoologist, and I love all birds. I find them utterly fascinating and beguiling. And I find myself a bit like John Keats, kind of leaping into their behavior and into their minds. And one group of birds I find particularly beguiling are apostle birds. Apostle birds are Australian birds. I urge you to look them up on YouTube. And what they do is they gang up with 6 to 20 other apostle birds, and they do everything together. They team build together, and they team build nests. They'll team build one single nest for one of them, and when they're doing all this team building, they tell each other about it really loudly. And this poem basically takes these ideas and pushes them together. The other thing too is, whenever I've looked into birds' nests and seen fledglings, not fledglings, chicks just raising their head, in my mind, I've always connected the chick with its little bald head with the profile of William Shakespeare. I hope I'm not alone in making this connection. But anyway, this poem is dedicated to a dear friend who was very supportive to me when I was a younger poet, the great Australian poet Les Murray. The apostle birds. There are 12, no, there are 13 apostle birds, scribbling with their beaks the gooey manures nabbed from a billabong's edge, snaffling straws of sedge from the parched Australian bush, dabbing sun-dappled mush, testing and tasting and pasting the glues of a nest cup with their plastering, perimetering beak trowels. The whole gang goes up blam as one and lands again as three, bickering, jokily jostling over a job their selfless genes squawked sod's law at. The apostle birds go on scrappily, scrabbling and shaping their small world's whirl of muck and straw, of happy dung and all, in which their featherless, brawling Shakespeares will gape and call. Okay, thank you. We'll have to take a little break now and go to questions. There'll be a little poem at the end, just a short one. But first, it'd be great to hear from you and from Deirdre.
Thank you very much, David. I loved that. It's a wonderful image of the little birds like Shakespeare's. So if you've got any questions, can you put them in the Q&A box, please? There's a comment in the chat, but you need to put it in the Q&A. I don't know a lot about birds, David, but am I right in thinking the starling is a mimic? As you said, the lyrebird. Isn't the starling a really good mimic too?
It is a mimic, yes. It'll imitate a lot of other birds. But one of the things I find fascinating about birds is that, in essence, they are all mimics. That they learn their call from their parent or parents or their group, their social group. In horrible experiments that were done in the 1950s, fledglings were taken away from their parents, and they did not innately produce their own species song. Instead, they produced a kind of horrible screech. And what happens is that they simply kind of learn the specific language of their bird. Also, too, a bird taken from its own species by chance, and by chance brought up in the company of others, will imitate often that bird too. But there are some birds which are obviously fantastic mimics. crows and parrots, starlings, lyrebirds, all of which are insufferably brilliant imitation. I just find them such a great kind of natural model for how artists work through early imitation, honing, and what kind of experiment might work to advantage for you.
Yeah, and that images you used of ventriloquism and throwing voices, it works really well with the birds. So any questions from the audience out there? You've been very quiet tonight. You're bilingual, David. Have you other languages as well? Are there connections? Because I was wondering if there are connections between Roma language and other languages that you recognize.
Yeah, the kind of the root language of Romani is Sanskrit.
Right.
And when I've read poems in different types of Romani to people who know Sanskrit or indeed Urdu actually as well, they will recognize words because they'll be very close. It would mean pani, for instance, which means rain in Romani, will mean the same in Urdu. But this is simply because of the ancient migration of Roma from northern India, and then in a diaspora throughout different countries since around the 12th century. But other words are then picked up along the way. I have always been, I say, partly because of my stammer, I've always been interested in the choices that are available to me to say things. And mimicry is one of my coping strategies, always was one of my coping strategies as a teenager. The other one simply is trying to find the least line of resistance through the sentences that I wish to say. And that often means using a kind of thesaurus of possibilities to nail precisely what I'm trying to say, even if I'm not using the most direct routes, which is a good apprenticeship, I think, for a poet. But I also spent time, because of my interest in European poets, which has been substantial since a very early age, I've also tried to pick up, I'm very interested in Spanish poets and French poets and Italian poets, but also Russian poets. I'm very influenced by writers like Tsvetaeva and Mandelstam. And have been since a very early stage. I found their way of writing so extraordinary. I imagine part of it is simply because I was somewhat autodidact in the way that I had to learn about poetry, because I was a scientist. I took what was to hand and I pursued it with enthusiasm. So when I first read Mandelstam, I didn't really know he was a Russian poet. I read him as a poet who was writing in translated English, and let him influence come what may. And that has its advantages and disadvantages. But yeah, polyvalency and possibility within language is a dreamscape. It's to be welcomed. But with Romani, I only really let it into my life about the age of 30 because of insufficient confidence,
right,
and fear. I mean, you don't go around speaking Romani in Blackpool.
Kathy's question is connected to that, actually. She said, can you talk more about your decision to start using Anglo-Romani in your poems, i.e. how did it start?
Yeah, it started off with a negative decision not to, because, as I say, speaking in Romani or declaring any sense of identification with travellers in Blackpool in the 1970s as a child would have resulted in bricks through your window. The detestation of Romani travellers continues to this day. And you are always aware of that, and therefore silences. But hey, silence also comes from the culture. To actually speak in Romani within a poem, it might be considered to be somewhat of a broaching of a secret. But the decision that came at the age of 30 was one of embracing half of me. To say it to myself, it felt like embracing half my soul that I was neglecting. And when I read about R.S. Thomas learning Welsh at the age of 30, I felt a certain commonality with that way of going about things, and his ardency about Welsh nationalism I found very interesting as well. I have a growing kind of ardency about Romani traveller rights. But I also enjoyed it, Kathy. I found it opened my poems out. It made them less self-consciously literary. I wanted to write like life. And when I was in my 20s, although I was publishing, I was writing poems which were literature. And I wanted to write a kind of anti-literature that was truer to how I proceeded in the world. And allowing Romani into it and letting it kind of explode within the poems was a great way of kind of pushing all those mannered tricks I'd picked up in my early years to one side and allowing me to kind of move through language more honestly and with a greater sense of possibility, particularly to do with narrative and character and understanding character from within. A lot of my poems are stories. These poems are stories to a large extent.
Somebody asked about the set spellings for the Romani words, or have you created your own transliterations of those?
Of what, sorry?
The set spellings for the Romani words. Are there set spellings, or do you?
Oh yeah, no. The great thing about Romani is that it's phonetic. It is spoken exactly as it's spelled. There are plenty of dictionaries out there, and I tend to use dictionaries, but I also talk to travellers too. The kind of the ones that I'm using are specifically contemporary Anglo-Romani, and I tend to be very almost scholarly about making sure that they're put down as they are spoken, but with all the little accents upon the way that they're said as well. It's a bit kind of meticulous in this way that I do that, accenting the points where they can be said, it being phonetic, because I want people to learn Romani. I think it would be very
good way to do it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and why not? Why not?
Yeah. Diana says, when you are editing your poems, do you go through a particular process? And if so, what is it?
Well, that is a very good question, and I can answer that by saying I am very merciless with my poems because they are equally merciless with me, and therefore we have to front each other out. Poems will pass through lots of different maquettes, as a sculptor might say, shapes and reshapings. We'll take them through lots of different forms as well. These little lyrebird sonnets emerged from a pontoon, and they were quite happy, if you like, within the pontoon structure until I came along and decided that in order for them to work within a whole book, I would break them into pieces and rewrite them. I think one way to answer the question about rewriting is that I have always, since my first book, I've always regarded a book of poetry as a form of poetry. Of course, the individual forms will make up that book, but the form is the book as a whole, and therefore the poems will be drafted, first of all, in their own rights to create their own lives, but ultimately to be part of a living, breathing community of poems within our whole village of the stretch of the book. They have to all work together. They can be pulled apart, but they need to be put back together, pulled apart, put back together. I do a lot of that, pulling apart and putting back together until they kind of reach a shape. And I'm sure any of you out there who are poets know that even when you publish a book, there's still an urge to kind of rewrite things as well. One of the things I found was a gift about doing the Invisible Gift, my selected poems, was that I actually rewrote a lot of the poems a little bit because I was unsatisfied with how they were working with each other. So I had to make them into a whole book again.
Viv's asking about your political commentary. I find it interesting that your political commentary is indirect. How did you arrive at this approach?
When I was younger, I did write political, what you might describe as political poems. particularly when I was writing a book about Osip Mandelstam, the poet who wrote under Joseph Stalin. And I engage a lot with the history of that period and its politics to try to understand it from within and to allow it to inflect through the poems. I have my own political points of view. Some of them are very strongly held, but they're not immovable. They do grade according to the character from whose point of view I might be writing, and the character has to be the truest thing within the poem. And if that character's views are inflected in some way and indirect, I've got to allow that to happen. If one looks at some of the characters in this, like Tyson Fury, for instance, his political point of view is a very, curious admixture. He has all sorts of things which might be regarded as quite flawed. What I'm really interested in with Tyson, for instance, is the politics inside himself, which is that he's always fighting himself. He's bipolar. He's always at war with himself and trying to win somehow through and never quite doing so. And that kind of personal politic is something I cannot but help be kind of invested in because of my investment in these characters. So there, by doing character, it is indirect.
Somebody asks, how does language influence your choice of form? For example, the stunning gazelle you read, if that's how you pronounce it, Ghazal, is it gazelle?
I always say gazelle, but if one's going to pronounce it according to the Indian form, also Pakistani form, it's hustle.
Oh.
Yeah, but I always say gazelle, but it's hustle. Yeah, in the case of that poem, that gazelle, the words, the birds, and Tawfiq Bahani came first. They came before the form, and it was only as I was pushing away. I very much wanted it to be a spoken poem, a poem one could memorize. And I remember kind of striding the fields around my house in Warwickshire, memorizing this poem as I was writing it, and found that one of the ways it was happening was that it was a song. It was definitely a song with a kind of chorus, and the ghazal is a sung form with its repeated sound line. And therefore, I let the song have its way. With form, I find you have to kind of you hear the poem, and the words fill the shape of that sound, and the form slightly follows that and kind of captures it. And then you do a lot of playing around in that captured space of sound. But you kind of hear the shape of the poem first. It's what Mandelstam would call an auditory hallucination. You don't even get the words first, you get the soundscape of the poem first. And the form kind of comes along and meets it at some point.
I have one more question before we have a final point from David. Alan wants to know, has there been more interest or less interest in poetry during this year's lockdown?
I've worked on a lot more poems during the lockdown because of the enforced the enforcement of staying at home. In some ways, lockdown is not that dissimilar in its tone to how my life works when I'm writing at my best. When it comes to poetry as a whole, I do think there are an awful lot of poems around. I think Caroline Duffy's website at Manchester Metropolitan University of Poems of Lockdown is a terrific resource that started off very early. The poems don't have to be about lockdown or isolation. The poems are written out of that condition. There's been a lot of very interesting books that have come out too. I actually think that the astonishing explosion of Zoom readings across the world for poets has been tremendous as a boon, not just in the availability, but the inclusivity of it. I have been able to attend readings to see and hear poets that I would never ordinarily be able to see or hear, because the events would be taking place in London or Europe or America, and they wouldn't certainly be coming to the Midlands. And I'd have to travel a long way to see them. But now they're in my home, as you are. You're in my home. What are you doing in my home? I rather like the idea that you're in my home, you see. And, you know, some part of it is that idea that I always think, there you are out there. How many coffee cups do I have in my house to give you coffee after this reading's taking place? And my only kind of sadness about kind of Zoom readings is that you don't have that moment after a reading where everybody gets together, if you like, around the kind of the fireside of what's happening and spend time together. The screen flickers off and the fire goes out. But while they're happening, I think they are quite magical. And I've actually taken part in Zoom readings that don't include me reading. It's me going along to listen and watch quietly with my camera off. I'll probably miss that actually when it goes.
Yeah. Well, I think we might end up with a blend of both live and once I agree we have found this online source. Well, can you give us another poem, David?
Sure. It's only a short one, and this is the seventh lyrebird that occurs just towards the end of the book. My vow glints with deer hooves daring beyond a tree line. My vow ambles like an anteater between turrets of termites. My vow slinks with a dog fox behind the prince and prince of rabbits. My vow blinks from fields, flints among frozen tares. Your vow trips a honey badger with motion capture cameras. Your vow trepans tectonics from a mountain's memory. Your vow is Raymond Carver posting the word hummingbird in a letter. Your vow traces bloody paw tracks to where? This grizzling bear. My vow grasps a glacier's crevasse and fair glass. My vow climbs Amazonian trees on a Hoatzin's dinosaur-winged fingers. My vow is Tess Gallagher holding the hummingbird of summer. Our vow sings the names we share with our children. Your vow clutches the Hoatzin's hapless fledglings in an Amazonian river. My vow is the lyrebird's thesaurus of memory. Thank you again. Thank you again, everyone, for coming to this event tonight and for giving your time so kindly, and to Deirdre and Simon and Pippa and Ross Bradshaw at the Five Leaves Bookshop.
Thank you very much, David. That was wonderful. For anyone who hasn't yet got hold of Fury, remember Five Leaves is now online, has a website where you can buy it. It's terrific. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Bye. And thanks everyone for listening. Good night.